Adam stood in front of the massive, rusted gates of Fun Toy Company. The factory loomed before him, its broken windows like the hollow eyes of a long-dead giant. The once bright sign, now faded and covered in grime, barely clung to the building, its letters peeling away like forgotten memories. For years, this place had been a source of mystery and urban legends. The factory had shut down suddenly a decade ago, and no one knew exactly why. All the workers had vanished overnight, leaving behind half-finished toys, abandoned workstations, and an eerie silence that never lifted. Some said it was financial ruin, others whispered about dark experiments gone wrong. But the most chilling rumors spoke of something unnatural lurking within, waiting for the factory's next visitor. Adam, a well-known urban explorer and videographer, had always been drawn to such places. His YouTube channel was dedicated to uncovering the forgotten corners of history, and Fun Toy Company was a prize he couldn't ignore. His flashlight beam cut through the thick mist swirling at his feet as he pressed his hand against the cold metal gates. They groaned in protest as he pushed them open, their hinges screeching like a wounded animal. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the stale scent of decaying plastic. Rows of shelves lined the walls, stacked high with old toys, stuffed animals with button eyes, plastic dolls frozen in eternal smiles, and mechanical figures covered in cobwebs. Some boxes lay scattered across the floor, their contents spilled out as if someone had left in a hurry. Adam took a deep breath and stepped inside, his camera recording everything. A faded poster hung on the nearby wall, catching his attention. Its bright colors had long since dulled, but the image was still clear enough to make out. It depicted a large-eyed doll with crimson curls and a blue dress, her hands outstretched as if welcoming a friend. Above her, the words "Meet Poppy, your best friend forever," were scrawled in bubbly letters. Something about the doll's expression unsettled him. Unlike the other toys, her face didn't seem frozen in manufactured joy. Instead, there was something knowing in her painted eyes, as if she could see him standing there. Adam shook off the unease and pressed forward, walking deeper into the factory. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the soft echo of his footsteps on the concrete floor. As he passed a row of abandoned desks, a faint creak sounded behind him. He spun around, his flashlight scanning the darkness. Nothing. He exhaled sharply, chalking it up to old building noises. But as he turned back, something caught his eye. One of the dolls on a nearby shelf had moved. It had been facing sideways a moment ago. Now, it was staring directly at him. His heartbeat quickened. He stepped closer, examining the doll. It was just a standard factory-made toy, its stitched-on smile innocent and unchanging. But the way it had shifted, it wasn't possible. Not unless... A sudden noise shattered the silence, a metallic clank from deeper within the factory. Adam stiffened. He wasn't alone. Gripping his flashlight tighter, he followed the sound, his breath shallow. It led him to the main assembly hall, where rows of decommissioned machinery sat like skeletal remains of a once thriving production line. Conveyor belts stretched across the room, coated in a thick layer of dust. A control panel stood at the center, its buttons and switches faded but still intact. And on the far end of the hall stood a single figure. At first, Adam thought it was another discarded toy. But as his flashlight beam settled on it, he realized it was something much bigger. It was Poppy. Only this time, she wasn't the size of a regular doll. She stood at human height, her porcelain face eerily pristine despite the dust-covered surroundings. Her blue dress swayed slightly as if stirred by an invisible breeze, and her painted lips curled in the faintest hint of a smile. Adam felt his breath hitch. His rational mind screamed at him this was just a prop, some forgotten promotional display left behind when the factory shut down. But deep down, in the primal part of his brain, he knew something was wrong. Before he could react, the factory lights flickered to life, bathing the hall in a sickly yellow glow. The old speakers crackled, and then... a voice. "You came to play, didn't you?" Adam's stomach dropped. Poppy's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging him. And then she moved. A single step forward. Slow. Deliberate. Adam took an instinctive step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but his legs felt leaden, locked in place by some unseen force. The speakers crackled again, the voice now softer, almost playful. "Let's play a game." The overhead lights flickered again, and for a fraction of a second, everything went dark. When they came back on, Poppy was gone. The silence stretched. The air grew heavy with an unnatural stillness. Then, from somewhere in the darkness behind him, a whisper. "I see you." Adam's breath came in short, uneven gasps. His flashlight trembled in his grasp as he frantically scanned the factory floor. Poppy had been there. A towering, unsettling presence. And now, she was gone. The silence in the air was deafening. Only the distant hum of dormant machinery remained, a ghostly reminder of the factory's former life. Adam forced himself to take a step forward, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He had faced eerie locations before, abandoned hospitals, underground tunnels, but this was different. This place wasn't just forgotten. It was watching. A soft scuffing noise echoed behind him. Adam spun around, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nothing. His nerves were screaming, his instincts begging him to run. But his curiosity kept him rooted. If Poppy was truly here, if something was still in his factory, he needed to find out why. He needed footage. Slowly, he lifted his camera and started recording. "All right," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "I just saw something huge. It looked just like the doll from the posters, but it moved." The lights came on for a second, and she was right there. He swallowed hard, listening to the quiet. And now she's gone. The red recording light blinked steadily. He turned the camera to capture his surroundings, the rusted conveyor belts, the half-assembled toys frozen mid-production, the abandoned workstations. Everything was as lifeless as when he had entered. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching against shattered plastic. A forgotten toy lay at his feet, a plush bear, its fur matted with dust. Its black button eyes stared blankly upward, and something about its tiny stitched smile sent a chill down his spine. Then, from somewhere deep within the factory, a click. Adam froze. The sound had come from the conveyor control panel across the room. He knew he hadn't touched it. His flashlight beam wavered as he approached, heart pounding. The dust on the panel had been disturbed, smeared by something small, like fingers. He swallowed hard and reached out. His fingertips brushed against the main power switch, which had been moved into the on position. Before he could react, the machinery roared to life. A deafening clatter filled the air as gears ground against rusted belts. Old, forgotten conveyor belts lurched forward, carrying pieces of discarded toys toward assembly stations. Sparks flew as robotic arms jerked into motion, trying to complete long-abandoned tasks. The entire room pulsed with unnatural energy, a ghostly reenactment of a time long past. Adam stumbled backward, gripping his camera tight. This wasn't possible. The factory had been dead for a decade. There was no way the power still worked. And yet, the machines moved as though they had never stopped. Then, through the cacophony of clanking metal and whirring motors, a voice. It wasn't over the speakers this time. It was close. Too close. "You're not supposed to be here." A cold shudder ran through Adam's spine. He turned sharply, his flashlight barely illuminating the towering shadows beyond the machinery. There, standing just beyond the moving conveyor belt, was Poppy. Her giant frame loomed in the dim light, her plastic skin eerily untouched by time. Her curly red hair framed a face locked in a knowing smile, her painted eyes gleaming like glass marbles. She took a step forward. The conveyor belt rattled violently as something metal snapped loose. Adam instinctively stepped back, his grip tightening around the camera. Poppy's head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable. "You need to leave." The voice didn't match her plastic lips. It was a whisper, an echo in the space around him. And yet, he knew it was hers. His throat ran dry. "What are you?" For a moment, there was no response. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, Poppy raised her hand. Adam felt his breath hitch as he watched her plastic fingers curl as if beckoning him forward. "Stay. Play. Forever." A blast of cold air whooshed past him, sending a flurry of dust and loose papers swirling into the air. The lights flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows across the factory walls. Then, everything went dark. Adam's breath came ragged. He reached out blindly, fumbling for his flashlight. The factory had been thrown into absolute blackness. And in that blackness, a sound. A single, soft tap against the floor. Then another. And another. Footsteps. Coming closer. The darkness was suffocating. Adam held his breath, pressing his back against the cold metal of a conveyor belt as the footsteps in the pitch-black factory grew closer. Each slow, deliberate tap against the floor sent shivers down his spine. His flashlight was useless. The moment the factory lights had flickered out, the device sputtered and died as well, leaving him utterly blind. His camera, still recording, captured only the sound of his ragged breathing and the eerie silence stretching between each footstep. Then, a whisper. "I see you." Adam clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay quiet. He had no idea where Poppy was, but she was close. Too close. The air shifted, something moving just out of reach. He could feel it, like static electricity dancing along his skin, an unseen force pressing in from all sides. It was as if the very walls of the factory were alive, breathing, waiting. Then came the giggle. A soft, playful sound, distorted by the vast emptiness of the room. It echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the metal walls in ways that didn't make sense. Adam swallowed hard. He had to move. Staying still wasn't an option, not when she was hunting him. He reached into his backpack, fumbling until his fingers brushed against a flare. With trembling hands, he yanked off the cap and struck it against the ground. Whoosh! A brilliant red glow erupted from the flare, painting the factory in flickering, blood-colored light. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, distorting the shapes of broken toys and rusted machinery. And there she was. Poppy stood just beyond the light's reach, her massive form frozen mid-step. Her oversized eyes gleamed, reflecting the fiery glow of the flare. Her plastic lips were curled into that same unsettling smile. But now, her head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Crack. Her neck jerked slightly to the side, as if something inside her had just snapped. Her fingers twitched. Then, she lunged. Adam barely had time to react. He threw himself to the side as the massive doll's arm came crashing down where he had just been standing. The impact sent a cloud of dust and shattered plastic into the air. Scrambling to his feet, Adam ran. He darted between rusted assembly stations, past conveyor belts that still trembled from their unexpected reactivation. His flare burned bright in his hand, but the light did little to push back the overwhelming sense of wrongness that filled the air. Behind him, Poppy moved with impossible speed. Her massive limbs jerked unnaturally, her motions erratic, like a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. "Come back," the voice echoed, though her lips remained unmoving. Adam ignored it. He needed to find an exit, fast. He sprinted past a row of decayed lockers, their doors hanging open like gaping mouths. A flickering exit sign loomed ahead, barely visible through the layers of dust and grime. His heart soared. There. Then, the floor collapsed. With a sickening crunch, the ground beneath him gave way. He barely had time to shout before he was falling, tumbling through darkness as debris rained down around him. The landing was brutal. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Pain exploded in his shoulder, but he had no time to dwell on it. Above him, the hole in the ceiling revealed the factory floor he had just been running across. And then, Poppy peered over the edge. Her massive head tilted, her glassy eyes locking onto him like a predator studying its prey. Adam scrambled backward, pushing himself up despite the pain. He had fallen into some kind of sublevel, a forgotten part of the factory buried beneath the main floor. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rust, and the only illumination came from his flickering flare. He turned sharply, searching for an escape. That's when he saw them. The others. Lined up against the far wall were rows of abandoned dolls, their bodies covered in dust and cobwebs. Their faces were eerily similar to Poppy's, wide eyes, plastic smiles frozen in time. But these dolls weren't moving. They were slumped forward, lifeless. Forgotten. Or so he thought. As he took a hesitant step forward, a single, horrible realization settled over him. The dolls were breathing. The sound was faint, barely audible over his own racing heartbeat. But it was there, a soft, rhythmic inhale, exhale. Adam took a step back. One of the dolls twitched. Then another. Then, all of them. Their plastic fingers began to spasm, their heads jerking upright in unison. A chorus of mechanical whispers filled the room, overlapping, blending together in a chaotic, nonsensical chant. Stay. Play. Forever. Adam turned to run, but the door slammed shut. The last thing he saw before the flare sputtered out was Poppy dropping into the hole after him. And she was smiling. Adam's breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away from the closed door, his fingers desperately clawing at the handle. It wouldn't budge. The metallic clang of the lock echoed in the confined underground space, sealing him in with them. The air was thick with dust and something else, something stale and rotting. The glow from his dying flare flickered across the rows of dolls lined up against the far wall. Dozens of them. Identical to Poppy, yet unmoving. For now. Adam's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. The breathing sounds, those awful, unnatural breaths, grew louder, overlapping in a dissonant rhythm. He took a slow step backward, his boots scraping against the cold concrete floor. Then, one of the dolls twitched. His stomach clenched. Another followed. Their little plastic fingers spasmed. Their heads jerked to the side in perfect unison, eyes flicking open, catching the dim glow of the flare like polished marbles. A whisper crawled through the room. Stay. Play. Forever. Adam swallowed the rising panic, forcing his shaking hands to grip his flashlight. He slammed the side of it, desperate for light. It flickered weakly before surging to life, casting a harsh beam across the underground chamber. The dolls' faces were frozen in their eerie smiles. But now, they were all looking at him. A metallic creak above him sent a fresh jolt of terror through his system. Slowly, Poppy descended from the hole in the ceiling. Her massive form moved with disturbing grace, her limbs too fluid for something made of plastic. Her oversized eyes gleamed as she touched the ground, landing in an eerily soft motion. Adam took another step back, bumping against an old, rusted workbench. His mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be. Poppy tilted her head, her painted lips curling ever so slightly. You're not leaving, Adam. His blood turned to ice. He hadn't spoken his name since entering the factory. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep his focus. The door was locked, the hole above too high to reach. He scanned the walls, his beam catching on an old, rusted ventilation grate near the far side of the room. It was small, but it was a way out. Poppy took a step forward. The dolls moved with her, their tiny legs clicking against the floor in unison. Adam didn't hesitate. He ran. The moment he lunged for the vent, a sharp screech rang out. The dolls exploded into motion, their tiny hands reaching for him, clawing at his ankles. He kicked out violently, sending a few tumbling back, but others swarmed forward, their plastic fingers latching onto his clothes, dragging him toward the floor. Poppy laughed. The sound was childlike, playful, wrong. Adam twisted, shoving off the creatures, forcing his body toward the grate. He grabbed onto the rusted metal and yanked with all his strength. It groaned, resisting, but the corroded bolts finally snapped free. He threw himself inside, crawling into the suffocating darkness of the vent just as cold fingers grazed his ankle. A sharp bang rang out behind him, Poppy's massive hands slamming against the vent opening. "Come back, Adam." Her voice was a sing-song whisper, crawling through the metal tunnel like a living thing. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He dragged himself forward, ignoring the jagged edges of the vent slicing his arms. The tunnel twisted and turned, an endless maze of rust and suffocating heat. The sound of scuttling behind him made his stomach lurch. The dolls were following. He could hear them, their tiny limbs skittering through the ventilation shafts, their whispers echoing through the narrow space. "Stay. Play. Forever." Adam gritted his teeth, his muscles screaming in protest as he crawled faster. The vent dipped downward, leading into another unseen chamber. He had no choice but to follow. His arms trembled as he forced himself to keep moving, his breath ragged. Then, a dim light ahead. Hope surged through him. He scrambled toward it, reaching the end of the tunnel where a second grate blocked his escape. He reared back and kicked. The metal barely budged. Behind him, the whispers grew louder. Closer. He kicked again, harder this time. The grate buckled. One more. One more. With a final, desperate strike, the grate ripped free, clattering onto the floor below. Adam didn't hesitate. He threw himself through the opening, landing in a heap on the cold cement. Silence. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He was in another section of the factory, this one lined with old security monitors. His relief was short-lived. One of the screens flickered to life. A grainy feed from the underground chamber appeared. The dolls stood motionless. The vent he had escaped from was dark, empty. Then, slowly, Poppy stepped into frame. She turned to face the camera, her head tilting just slightly. Her painted lips didn't move, but her voice crackled through the factory's speakers. "Run while you can, Adam. We'll be seeing you soon." The monitors all shut off at once. Adam stood frozen, his breath ragged. Then, from somewhere deep within the factory, the sound of footsteps. And they were getting closer. Adam's breath came in short, uneven gasps as he scrambled through the damp, narrow vent. The factory was massive, and every twist and turn seemed to lead him deeper into its forgotten bowels. He had no idea how long he'd been crawling, but his arms ached, and the faint noise of footsteps still echoed behind him as though something or someone was following. The vent finally opened into a small room, and Adam emerged, blinking in the dim light. His heart raced as he took in the surroundings. This was different from the factory floor above. The walls were lined with old, dusty security monitors, their screens flickering in a way that sent a chill crawling down his spine. The room smelled stale, as if no one had been here for years. He stood up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. He had no idea where Poppy was now, but he knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not in a place like this. As Adam made his way toward one of the monitors, he noticed a faint glow coming from one of the screens. The grainy footage flickered, revealing a familiar scene, the room he had just left, the one with the rows of dolls. But the dolls weren't frozen anymore. They were moving. His stomach churned. The camera feed zoomed in, showing the lifeless bodies of the dolls beginning to twitch. Their plastic hands twitched, their heads jerked to the side as if something within them had awakened. The scene was surreal, horrifying, even. It was as if they were waiting for him to return. Waiting for him to play. Adam's mind raced. Had this all been some kind of experiment gone horribly wrong? The factory, the dolls, the constant feeling of being watched, it all pointed to something far more sinister than a mere abandoned toy factory. The screen blinked again, and suddenly the image shifted to a different part of the factory. This time, the footage was clear. Poppy. Her enormous form appeared in the grainy footage, standing in the same underground chamber where Adam had narrowly escaped. The camera zoomed in on her, her painted face, her eyes gleaming like glass marbles in the dim light. But there was something more chilling this time. As Adam stared at the screen, Poppy turned slowly, her head tilting toward the camera as though she knew he was watching. Her lips didn't move, but the voice crackled through the factory's old speakers. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" Adam's skin crawled. His heart pounded in his chest. It was as if she was speaking directly to him, as if she knew every move he had made. How could that be? How could a doll, no, a thing, know so much? The room was silent except for the low hum of the monitors. Then, just as quickly as it started, the feed cut out and the monitors turned to static. Adam rushed to the next screen, his fingers trembling as he pressed buttons in a desperate attempt to bring the images back. Nothing. The screens were blank. Frustration boiled within him. This place, it wasn't just abandoned. It was alive. It was waiting. Waiting for him, just as Poppy had said. But why? What was the true purpose of Fun Toy Company? He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. If he was going to get out of this place, he needed answers. He needed to find out what really happened here, what had turned the factory into this nightmare. Then, suddenly, a noise broke the silence. A faint clicking sound. Something mechanical. Adam's heart skipped a beat. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, standing just inside the doorway, was Poppy. Her massive form blocked the exit, her expression as unreadable as ever. She didn't move, but her eyes seemed to pierce into him like she was studying him, analyzing his every move. "You're not supposed to be here, Adam," Poppy's voice echoed softly, the words reverberating around the room like a twisted lullaby. Adam swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had no idea what she was or what she wanted, but he was starting to realize that escaping wasn't going to be easy. Not when it was clear she had control over everything in this factory. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick with dread. The factory wasn't just abandoned, it was alive with something dark and ancient. And it had been waiting for him all along. "You're just like the others," Poppy continued, her voice softer now. "All of you, you play, and then you stay. Forever." Adam felt a shiver run down his spine. The realization hit him with full force. He wasn't just a trespasser here, he was part of something much larger, something far more horrifying than he could have ever imagined. The dolls. The whispers. The games. It was all part of an experiment gone wrong, an experiment that had created Poppy and the others. And now, Adam was trapped in a nightmare where the toys were the hunters and he was the prey. Poppy's eyes glimmered as she took a step forward, her mechanical limbs moving with unnatural grace. "Come, Adam. Play. Forever." Adam's breath caught in his throat as he backed away, his heart racing. There had to be a way out, there had to be. But with every step he took, Poppy followed, her unblinking gaze never leaving him. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the chamber as he fumbled for a way to escape. But the room was closing in on him. The dolls were waking, the factory was alive, and Poppy was everywhere. "You can't run from me, Adam," she whispered, her voice like a soft breeze. "We're all waiting for you." Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. A loud, mechanical whirring filled the air as the walls began to shift, moving inwards as if the factory itself was reshaping to trap him. Panic surged through Adam's chest as he realized he had run out of time. This was no longer just a factory. It was a maze, a living, breathing entity that was out to claim him. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and Poppy's voice echoed in his ears. "Stay. Play. Forever." As the room began to darken, Adam realized the truth: there was no escape. This place had no end. And Poppy, the twisted doll, was the keeper of the factory's dark secret. The game had only just begun.